if you're like me, your eyes start to glaze over a little bit by the time we get to Leviticus. And I'm far more interested in reading about Genesis. But Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks says to us that what we have in Leviticus is a powerful model of radical transparency. Rather than a secret lore that's reserved for the elite, in Leviticus, we're offered this model where even the tiniest details of procedures are made accessible to the masses. And the masses are then told, hold the priests, hold the institution, hold the temple accountable for following these procedures and practices. What's more, we're told, Asher nasi yachateh, when a leader sins. Not if a leader sins, when a leader sins. Because there's a recognition that our leaders who are given power will abuse that power in some way. And so the question isn't if, it's when. When that occurs, how do we respond? How do we hold each other accountable? What system is there to repair that damage? That is the beauty and the power of Leviticus. And the wild thing is that everything that our tradition is teaching us in Leviticus, it is supported by research. Two researchers, Patessa and Thao, they conducted a study where they sought to create a condition of moral hazard in the laboratory. And so they brought people in, participants, and they said to them, you're going to be given money. And this money you can invest, and you have the chance of doubling or tripling this money. Of course, you also have the chance of losing this money. But here's the thing. There's going to be a group of you who will be the bosses. And the bosses are not investing their own money. The bosses are investing other people's money. Hence, we have a condition of moral hazard. And as we know, in conditions of moral hazard, people who are given power are more likely to abuse that power. And so the researchers wanted to see what would happen if they created a system of outcome accountability and procedural accountability. In the outcome accountability condition, in the outcome accountability condition, bosses were told, you will be held accountable to everybody else as to whether or not you made money for them. Did you lose money? Did you make money? Outcome accountability. In procedural accountability, the bosses were told, you will be held accountable for the factors you took into consideration for the process you undertook in making your decisions. And what the researchers found was that bosses in the procedural accountability condition were far less likely to abuse their power, that is, to take risks that were very great, that were unwarranted with other people's money. They were less likely to abuse their power if they were held accountable for the procedures they used in making those decisions, and far more likely to abuse their power if they were held accountable for the outcomes. And so the researchers conclude, if we wish to prevent abuses of power in our communities and our institutions, we must have really good procedures and policies, and we must demand accountability to these procedures and policies. And that is what we've set to do with the founding of Sacred Spaces. Sacred Spaces works to prevent abuses of power across the lifespan, because people don't begin, and women don't begin, to become harassed or abused the moment they step into the workplace. Rather, it's from the moment a child is born in our community that the culture that surrounds them begins to lay the foundation for a culture that allows for and sometimes even promotes this form of harassment and abuse. And so we need to look across the lifespan, and we need to look at the governance and health of our institutions. And so Sacred Spaces, we partner with institutions and we work with them to put in place policies and training to prevent these abuses of power. And what I'll do here with you today is I will take you through a roadmap of how you can put these systems in place in your own institutions. Naomi, I've spoken here about abuses of power as they occur in organizations. And I think that's often how we think of the term abuse of power. But really, any relationship has the potential to have power abuse, because there is always a power dynamic in a relationship. And particularly at this moment in time during a pandemic where people are increasingly working from home, the lines between the workplace and the home are blurred. And so I wonder if you could speak to this issue of abuse of power and the root causes of that as it applies in the home, as it applies to issues of domestic violence.
Thank you. Well, thanks, first of all, Shira, for your beautiful framing and text-based thoughts about why it's so incredibly important to do work at the policy level. And I just want to give an example of one of the things that you are talking about, and as it applies to the work of both of our organizations, because we are here under this beautiful umbrella of shelter from the storm. And that, of course, is what Shalom Bayit does, and the work that I've done for the past 30 years in working in the domestic violence field is providing that literal as well as figurative shelter from the storm for women in the Jewish community who typically have not been believed when they have talked about violence perpetrated against them, whether it's at home or in the workplace. And so I just really want to thank Alana and the SRE organizers for coming up with this framing, because I think it is so important and a kind of sheltering that we don't often talk about in Jewish spaces. As you pointed out, our work is so much more kind of in everyone's face right now, both because communally we are working from home. And so I think the thing that that we at Shalom Bayit have tried to talk about for so long, about how Jewish women can't actually be active leaders and participants in the Jewish community if they're not safe in their own homes, it is harder to ignore right now when we are literally working out of our homes. And where we are witness to what's happening in everyone's homes, and those lines are no longer so separate. And I definitely want to talk about that further. But I also really love your drill down on what we get out of Leviticus. And I want to give a really concrete example as this applies to our work. So you talked about looking at this across the lifespan. And I'm going to pick a point on that lifespan and talk about teens for a minute. So lots of us, if you've been a teen or had a teen, have experienced or seen bullying happen. And a lot of times we get that question coming to us from young people, and actually not just teens, even in preschool or kindergarten, somebody coming to an adult and trying to make a difficult choice about whether to tell or not. There's a bullying expert, Barbara Coloroso, who has a beautiful framing around these tough questions that parents and adults ask about, is this tattling or telling? And so we have this kind of culture of like, don't tattle, and how do you actually know when something is tattling and when it's telling? And I think the same thing is a question on many people's minds about harassment in the workplace, about the kinds of things that we see in communal spaces when somebody sees a behavior that they don't agree with, and maybe have this big question on our mind of, should I tell or not tell? And I think we have a Jewish answer to that in Leviticus 19:16, which is that classic text that we all know about, not standing idly by the blood of your neighbor, but it's also the same sentence that has the prohibition against lashon hara. So it's not an accident, in my opinion, that those two things are in the same sentence. And as you pointed out, Shira, this whole section is so much about how we think about the minute details of how we interact with people, and why those details are so important in order for us to be in relationship with each other in an ethical way. And so in my mind, this is like the text that helps us distinguish between tattling and telling. That if it is just for the purpose of creating harm or making someone feel bad, that's lashon hara, that's tattling. But if it is actually to get someone out of trouble, then that's not standing idly by, and then we are compelled Jewishly to tell. And this is a distinction that Barbara Coloroso makes in her book about bullying, to help teachers, educators, and parents And she's not Jewish, but I find so many of her teachings to be remarkably Jewish-like. But this is something that I think our communal leadership does not abide by in thinking about those questions. So to me, that's an example of where we can learn from our Jewish tools and say, hey, if we're a community that is actually living by our values, then we need to encourage people to speak up, to be safe to speak up. And I don't just mean the survivors to speak up, but really the witnesses and the leaders and the people with power to use that power well, so that when we think about all of these abuses of power that you brought up, whether it's a systemic misuse of power like racism or sexism globally, or an individual misuse of power in a relationship, that we can do the transformative work because power in and of itself isn't inherently bad. It's bad when it is used unwisely, right? So we can have power over and we can have power to. And when we talk about power to, that's where we get concept of empowerment and the actual antidote to all of these systems of oppression. So that's really our goal at Shalom Bayit, is looking at all of those ways that power is used in our community, and through the lens of our Jewish values, transforming that to a community based and grounded in empowerment rather than using power over. When we do that, that's when we get a culture of consent and a culture of respect, which is ultimately, I think, what we're all aiming for and what the SRE network stands for.
Barbara, you're muted.
I think Barbara's still trying to talk, but.
No, actually, who's going first? Shira, are you going first?
Sure.
Okay, go ahead.
All right. So what I'd like to do right now is share with you something that we've created when we work with organizations. We just call it very simply a roadmap to creating sacred space. And there are three things I want you to know about this roadmap. One, that it exists. Two, that it's meant to be tailored. And three, that it works. And I'll go into more detail about what I mean by all of those things. But I think it's important to know that there is the idea of a roadmap, because often what people say to us is, we really want to do this work. How do we get started? Or they'll say, what does it mean to do this work? And I think sometimes we think of this work as this big, these big two words, this work, and it's completely overwhelming and daunting. And then the problem, the danger of that, is that we start to think of this as this theoretical. Theoretically, we are all committed to safety, respect, and equity, but we don't know how to actually implement and make it happen on the ground. And I think when we get too overwhelmed, we get off track. So it's a simple roadmap. I'll take you through it, and it's not meant to be all or nothing or all at once. Jump in wherever it works for you. Danielle, can you please share your screen? Great. 5 phases to this roadmap. The first is readiness. The second is assessment. The third is to codify policies. The fourth is to train volunteers, staff, constituents, your entire community. And the fifth is to maintain this roadmap. To maintain your efforts. And the reason we created this roadmap like this is we've tried various aspects, right? We think of the work as policy development or training, but we've come to learn that without all of these components together, the work doesn't take root in shifting the causes, the systemic causes of abuse of power. Danielle, you can stop sharing your screen now. Thank you. And I will just very briefly take you through each of these 5 phases. So in the readiness phase, the idea here is that you can't jump in straight from saying, I want to do this work, to instituting policies. We've seen that from the moment an organization says, we're ready to do the work, it could actually take them about 1.5 years to get ready, because there are really important conversations that need to happen. This has to happen from the top, Where is your board on this issue? Where is your senior leadership? And it also has to involve everybody at every level of the organization and the people you serve. And if it's not doing those things, then it's not going to take root in the way it needs to. It can't be something that's about avoiding liability. It needs to be something that is not reactive, but rather proactive, a moral Jewish imperative. This is what it means to be a Jewish organization. And so to that end, we're working in partnership with Rabbi Dr. Mira Wasserman and the RRC to create a Judaic study guide that will root this work in Jewish values and give communities and institutions a chance to start first by engaging in what this work is and where we need to go. The second phase is to assess. You have to ask yourself, where are our unique risks? Not where do we stand, not what's our commitment, what's going on the ground right now in our institution? And I don't just mean, do you have a policy? I mean, what are your practices in real time? Here's an example. You may have had a practice in your institution, but if you are now online, that has shifted. So you need to assess the new risks. So for example, we are now seeing an increase of online sexual exploitation, and predators are using Jewish organizations whose programming has moved online as a way to access participants. And we are receiving case consults where organizations are reaching out to us because their participants are being targeted. And this is not something Jewish organizations are thinking of, which makes sense because everybody's scrambling. How do we get our in-person program to be an online program? Or we're lowering the standards to work in a Jewish organization. So Jewish organizations are so strapped right now, so overwhelmed that they're accepting volunteers, they're lowering their screening measures. But at a time when we have increased access to people and we have access to them in very vulnerable situations, rather than decrease our safeguards, we should be increasing our safeguards. So this is what I mean by assess. And when we talk about codify, it's exactly this. What are your policies? And now how do your policies apply to whatever risks you have going on? An example of this is that we had an institution that called us just as the pandemic was starting and they were shifting online, and they said there is someone on our staff that we are deeply concerned about. We believe they will be isolated at home with their abuser. And so rather than having these policies just about who's allowed to enter the workplace and orders of protection, they now started to ask questions of how do we offer support to this individual while they are stuck at home. Train. So that means training everybody. One rabbi attended one of our trainings, a 6-month program called Sacred Synagogues. And at the end of it, he came up to us to share this story. And he said he had given a sermon because we had said, communicate with your congregation. And so he gave a sermon about how important this work was. He started to implement policies. And a woman approached him and said to him, Rabbi, I want to ask you questions. And she started to really nail down on the policy and say, when you say this, what does that actually mean? And started to tell him about her own abuse and wanted to know, would her abuser be welcome back in the synagogue? Where did the synagogue stand? Where was the synagogue's leadership? And he said to her, your abuser will never be welcome in this synagogue. We stand with you. And then proceeded to outline all of the steps that he would take. And he said to us, I felt that I could do that because I knew I had a system of support. I had 7 other staff members who had been trained with me who would back me up. And what the woman said to this rabbi was, this is the first time in 7 years that me and my children feel safe in the Jewish community. Every time I've asked these questions, I've been met with, absolutely, we support you. But when it comes down to it, nobody wants to take any sides. And finally, maintain. It's not enough to have these systems in place, but they need to be maintained for the long term. They are not meant to be policies that sit on a shelf. They must be living, breathing documents. Too often, we stand here and then something actually happens. And this is when it gets really hard to abide by our policies. And communities and organizations are split between the right way to respond and who to support. One organization we worked with recently had a serious crisis where one of their staff members was abusing others in their organization. But because they knew what to do, They called immediately. We had an immediate crisis consult. We were able to get wraparound services to the organization as this was happening, with psychologists on the ground, with mental health professionals who were providing space for the community to dialogue about what was happening in real time and to provide healing and support. So instead of this being something they had to correct later, they did it right the first time. And though many people in their organization were involved in this, everybody was, they were transparent about what was going on. Somehow this didn't divide the community. This didn't become your next media story because they were able to work together. And I share that because I think we only hear the stories about how it divides a community. And I wanted to share that one. Those are the 5 phases. And so I bring you back to this point, which is there's a roadmap. Jump in wherever it makes sense for your organization. Tailor it to your community. This is not a checklist. Nobody wants to be on a road trip with somebody who has to check off each step. If it deviates in your community, that's fine. And know that this does work because it's the process of engaging in the work that matters, not your end product. Naomi, can you tell us what this might look like in the realm of domestic abuse and at Shalom Bayit?
Yeah, thank you so much, Shira. I just love your framing. I have to say, as an organization that's also been supporting congregations and Jewish organizations to do policy development work, it's so amazing to see you and your powerful work and Sacred Spaces come on the scene to really coach people through with your framework. Because you know what you were talking about reflects our experience on the ground. You know, and we started with helping organizations and particularly synagogues create policies around domestic violence, and now we are doing it more broadly around gender-based violence. So I want to back up a little bit and just say a few things about where Shalom Bayit gets its roots and what we do. So we've been around for almost 3 decades now, and as you might imagine, as a domestic violence organization in the Jewish community, that picture of how we do our work looks really different now than it did in the early 1990s. And one of those things has to do that. One of the major changes really has to do with a shift in rabbinic and congregational awareness and support. So the change that happens at the institutional level is so important. We have 3 primary responses to gender-based violence at Shalom Bayit. The first, of course, is our support for survivors, and primarily we do crisis intervention, safety planning, and counseling work with women, Jewish women, who have been abused by an intimate partner. And I'll talk in a minute about what that looks like during the pandemic and how that work has been impacted. But we also do a lot of prevention, education, and work to really transform the Jewish community's response to abuse. And our programs that do that are our Love Shouldn't Hurt Team program, which does healthy relationships work and consent education with middle school, high school, and college students, as well as working with Jewish educators and parents to really do this work, starting with young people. As you so aptly pointed out in your introduction, we have to start this work with kids so that they hopefully don't become the people that need our support as adults, and so that they can actually not only prevent abuse in their own lives, but be part of, and young people really are part of this solution of rethinking consent and how we talk to each other, and what qualities they are looking for in their human interactions, whether that's with their friends as young people or in their intimate relationships later. We also do community education around gender-based violence, and it was sort of a natural expansion for us a couple of years ago, having done domestic violence work for several decades, to start teaching about preventing sexual harassment and sexual violence more broadly, because the roots, as we talked about in the beginning, the roots of those issues are the same. So while the services may look different for a survivor of sexual harassment or intimate partner violence, you know, we are all teaching about sexism and the roots of gender-based violence that allow these things to happen, whether it's happening in the workplace or at home. So within that, I'm really excited about a couple of things that we are working on right now, one of which is, of course, similar to what you're doing, policy development work with local organizations. Here we are in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we're working with lots of local Jewish organizations on creating policies to address and also prevent gender-based violence. And we see that globally. So not just the workplace policy, but also how are they going to help that congregant who talks to that rabbi that you just talked about. And I do see on the ground many, many rabbis having a similar response to that story that you shared, saying, I might not have been able to have this response of accountability if I didn't have that policy in place already. We are also, through our Mensch Up initiative, working on gathering groups of men together to talk about healthy Jewish masculinity and how to be allies to women. And that is something that I think our movement really needs, not just lip service. Yeah, we think this work is great and important, but, and this is something that I think the SRE network should be grappling with. What are the actual changes that we are asking men to make in their lives? What shifts do they need to make in their interpersonal interactions, in how they talk about women and to women, and how do we rethink and define that Jewishly? And so, so during the pandemic, I think there was this question on the table, because you've all heard in the news how the surge of domestic violence and how intense it has been for people trapped at home with their abusers has really led all of us to focus on the crisis aspect of our services. And the question on the table that lots of people were thinking about is, you know, what does this mean for our SRE work? And is it still relevant to be talking about sexual harassment when nobody's in their workplace? And the answer, of course, is yes, it's relevant, because number one, as you pointed out, Shira, these things are happening online. We still have questions about, as we're having all these national Jewish webinars, what does it mean, for example, for someone who's a known sexual harasser to be participating in that webinar with potentially the people that they have victimized, and how are we going to respond as a community? And similarly, because it is actually not just about how we physically interact at the water cooler, but it is about those broader systems that exist within our organizations and individual leaders' ability to respond to those things and to really build a culture of respect, however that workplace is convening. So just on the ground, a couple of things that we have seen. Interestingly, some of the organizations that we were working with pre-pandemic to do training and policy development work have continued doing that. Some of those are because they wanted to do something proactive and preventive, and other organizations are dealing with situations that happened of sexual violence within their staff before the pandemic, and they just feel, rightly so, that they know that they need to address those issues even if their staffs are no longer gathering in person. And I really commend those leaders, because it's incredibly hard to do layer upon layer of difficult work when, you know, we are all, as organizational leaders, also coping with the very big impacts of the pandemic to our organizations. For domestic violence survivors, I see kind of 4 categories of how people are impacted. So we have the one that you are all seeing in the media, which is people that are trapped at home with their abusers. And that might be true for your staff in both directions, right? So you might have staff who are working from home and unable to escape the abusive dynamic of their partner. And you might also have staff who are those abusers. And, you know, because 1 in 4 Jewish women will be abused by an intimate partner in her lifetime, I'm just going to pause there, 1 in 4, because, you know, we can just even think about, by sheer numbers alone, the number of people on this call. You know, we know that some of those people are us. And some of the abusers are us and our board members and people within our organizations, and there's just no escaping that. You know, I think for those people on our end at Shalom Bayit, you know, we have seen increasing levels of trauma, increasing levels of frequency and severity of the abuse, because there's no escape. People don't have that ability to, you know, be at school or work or outside the house and even get a break. So that's been the most difficult aspect of our work during the pandemic is just trying to keep women safe at a very basic level. And safety planning has really shifted to things like, you know, what is a safe room in your house that you can escape to for 5 minutes, which is a really different kind of safety planning. So lots of harm reduction there. Then there's another category of people that are abuse survivors that are not trapped in those situations, but they are on their own now. So if you can imagine what it's like to be a single mom, having left, it's lonely it's really hard to leave your marriage or your relationship and take care of your kids on your own. Now you're there 24/7 parenting, or maybe you have to take kids back and forth between houses. And for all, you know, families with 2 houses and kids, you know that is difficult in a pandemic. And abusers are basically using they will use any tool they can. And so that is true of someone who is a perpetrator of sexual harassment or domestic violence. And so, you know, it's not different from looking at police brutality. People who are abusive use the tools that they can. And so now what they are using is COVID-19 as a threat, to weaponize that you can't go out or you must go out despite people's, you know, health concerns or immune system vulnerabilities. So, and then of course there's huge financial implication for survivors who are on their own. A third category is those who are thinking of leaving. So there were many people that might have been like on the verge of that personal exodus at the moment when shelter in place hit and all those plans were canceled and people can't go see the family member or friend, et cetera. And then finally, there are all the ones who do not yet know. So if we think about like that fourth child at Passover, like the one who does not yet know, this is a whole category of people for whom we are expecting a large surge of domestic violence calls to come after the pandemic is over. Why? Because the pandemic has increased intensity of everything. And so if you are in a healthy relationship, maybe you're rediscovering sweetness of being together with your beloved at home. But if you're in a relationship that's unhealthy or tense, those tensions are going to increase and escalate during the pandemic. And so people that may not have previously thought of their relationship as abusive are starting to see those signs happening now. But they're not safe to call necessarily because they can't actually get a private moment to call. So what gender-based violence experts across the country are predicting is that for many types of violence, domestic violence, sexual assault, and certainly child abuse, that when those opportunities to reach out for help open up in a few months, that we are going to see a big surge in the incidence rate. So I want to just close this piece with a few things that you can do. I really appreciated, Shira, your tangible creating organizational change. And I think that talking about these issues when we actually start talking about violence that women are facing can feel so hard and so overwhelming. But there are some really important things that everybody can do as a friend, as an organizational leader. So one thing that you can do is quite simply have your antenna up. So what I mean by that is if something feels off to you in your interaction with a friend or a colleague, find a private moment to ask them. Pay attention to that feeling you're having and ask them how they are, or ask them a direct question about how's it going being at home with their partner? You know, that must be hard. Or if you see something happen in the background of a Zoom call, don't just ignore it, but reach out to that person and check in on them. Another thing that I would just say is you don't have to be the expert on everything. Like, we are an incredible network of people. Reach out to each other. So I want to offer myself and Shira as resources to you all. You know, if something is happening in your organization or with a friend or a family member, call us, because this is the work that we do. And you know, if it is about an individual crisis, we can handle that at Shalom Bayit. And if it is about an organizational crisis, either one of us can help you with that. But I think, you know, it's really important that we need to be in this together, and that part of the where we find shelter from the storm, when those structures of shelter look really different, especially in a pandemic, is by creating a new idea of what shelter can be. And I think that we do that communally by building a different framework and a different meaning of what shelter is, particularly for groups of people like women, despite the fact that we make up half the population, who have actually not properly been sheltered in the world and in the community as we know it right now. So I just really appreciate everybody for being part of this, and encourage you all to ask questions and join in conversation. We're really grateful that on day 2 of this convening, we can actually see you all on Zoom and chat with you. So thank you to the organizers for making that possible today. And we want to hear from you.
Okay. We spent a lot, it's hard to tell that Naomi and Shira and I spent a long time yesterday trying to figure out what this session would look like. And it's nothing like what we said, but we are going to go on until 1:30 so that you are not rushing out. And we have a couple of questions, but we certainly could take more, and I won't give you mine until we have some of these. Let's start with Lashon Hara, Naomi, because I think all of us have been there with that conversation. And you said that and what was the other one? Telling me what?
I'm having a little bit of trouble hearing you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Lashon Hara, we got that.
Okay, Lashon Hara.
Yes.
You talked about getting people out of trouble is what we should be doing. I'm not sure that that is the way somebody in an organization would see it. If it were a board member, for instance. I don't know. The question is, how do we really deal with this? And we have watched organizations give their perpetrators, especially if they're donors, a buy. Have you dealt, have either of you had to deal with that?
Most definitely. So yeah, the issue of accountability is, I think it's like the last stand. Like, we finally moved the needle in the Jewish community to a place where most of the Jewish community would say, okay, abuse does happen here and it's not okay. But we actually have not moved the Jewish community to a place where consistently we do something about it in the right direction when the players are people we know. So there's always sort of like this, oh yeah, abuse is bad and wrong, but not this person. And that's the past that I think you're referring to. So when we look at how Lashon Hara has been used historically, like, Lashon Hara is a great it's a great concept. Like, don't treat people badly, don't gossip about people. But historically, it's been mostly used against women. So a concrete example of this is in the get. Very often, you will see a Beit Din issue a divorce with the contingency that the woman is not allowed to speak about the man or the abuse, and yet he's trash talking her everywhere. So what I see in congregations is sometimes similar things, like women are asked not to talk about the abuse because that would be, it would damage the abuser's reputation. And yet the abuser continues to say horrendous things about the person that they victimized. So there is still a huge gender bias in how the concept of Lashon Hara is applied throughout the Jewish community. And so one thing I think we need to do is unpack and look at that gender bias and get it to stop. And then also, I think this issue of policy is so important, because part of why we want to have synagogues and organizations have a policy is so that it isn't about those individual people. They don't get to say, well, this guy, like, I've never seen him do anything, because that's part of how gender-based violence operates, is it's so private. So we have to be able to look at not just who said what and hear the male voice louder, because that's what's always louder, but we actually have to look at what policies we want to have that come from Jewish values about what we feel is right, and not have that huge disconnect between what we say are our values and how that actually plays out with respect to safety.
Shira, there's another question for you, Shira, if I can move on. Is that okay?
Yes, Naomi did a great job answering that.
Okay. the question is, have you dealt with other issues other than equity, especially gender equity, like racial equity in any organizations? And if so, how do you deal with it with Ready and assessing?
Yeah, this is a difficult question because there are no easy answers. The answer is yes. When we deal with policy development or training and we're talking about discrimination or creating places that are equitable, we're talking about it across all issues. It's not just about gender. If we focus only on gender, we're missing all that we need to do to create a space that is truly respectful, welcoming, inclusive. And when we see organizations that are discriminatory in this way, but not in this, ultimately it will backfire. And you cannot combat abuses of power by maintaining that abuse in some realms, but not in other. Specifically, the reason I say it's so complicated is because when we talk about issues of safety, sometimes safety requires intersecting with the criminal justice system. And as we all know, our criminal justice system is broken. And so it becomes really complicated when we have to ensure safety, such as, for example, mandatory reporting in cases of child abuse or elder abuse. And so there's the law to comply with, and the law is there for a reason, right? When Jewish institutions, when rabbis or Bayit try to handle these things on their own, they simply don't have the jurisdiction or the power they need to be able to put in place the safeguards and enforcements that need to be there to keep the community safe. And yet, as soon as we involve law enforcement, it's complex. When we talk about sex offender registries, well, they exist. And so once they're there, that data are there, and we should have it and use it. And yet at the same time, sex offender registries have historically been used as a mechanism to further discriminate and to penalize and to turn something very punitive that would otherwise maybe not be, such as two juveniles who are communicating with each other, somebody who has urinated publicly. There's a whole range of things that could land you on the sex offender registry. If we're intersecting with the criminal justice system and there's a person who's perpetrating abuse and that person is a person of color, we understand that what happens next may very well be very different than if the person wasn't a person of color. And so these are all things that need to be considered. In addition, things like equity about religion, especially in Jewish spaces. So we might see prioritization of one denomination or prioritization of Jews over people who are not Jewish and working in the same workplace. We might see the intersection of LGBTQI issues, particularly as it relates to sexual offending, where this group of individuals is now at higher risk or may be targeted in different ways. And so there are so many ways that these issues intersect. And what we do, our approach, because I don't think there's anything easy about this, is that we bring a certain expertise and we make sure that when we're dealing with a case or putting in place policies or training, we bring in experts on these issues, because there are wonderful organizations both within the Jewish community and beyond that specialize in each of these. And we have to work together to make sure that we each bring our own lens, and together we can create a more equitable, safe, and respectful Jewish community.
Naomi, well, let me ask both of you, since we're going to really run out of time. What's next for each of your organizations? Let's start there, or let's stop there. Naomi, can you, what's on the agenda for Shalom Bayit? You're muted.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. For us, I think we'd really like to see some tangible numbers of organizations instituting policies, and in particular synagogues, because that is so much of where that interplay of Jewish life happens in that is both workplace and interpersonal. So I think the synagogues can be really incredible role models, and they're complex organizations. So for us, tangibly, we'd like to see across denominations and across different geographic areas. We represent a 9-county area in California. So we'd really like to see a movement where synagogues are doing that work to create policy. And as Shira said, it can take, this is not an overnight process. So signing on to do that might be a year-long commitment or more. And that is one thing. We'd also love to be able to stabilize our services. I just have to say, we're one of the smallest Jewish organizations in the Bay Area Jewish landscape here. So I think that says a lot about how women are prioritized, and that's something that I'm personally working to shift. I don't think that women's safety should be a sideline issue in the Jewish community. And then finally, I would say that a big thing that we are working on that's really next up for us is to make sure that our youth program is in every Jewish institution. We're in a lot of them, but I really want to see both locally to us in California and nationally that healthy relationships, education, and building a culture of consent is something that is integrally woven into the fabric of Jewish education, that we just consider a priority for Jewish youth. That's what I really want to see, and I would be very excited to see the needle move on that, because I think that's where it's at for the future.
That's very interesting. There are also all these organizations, mostly federations, that have started these philanthropy groups for kids. And it seems to me if you get in there, then when those kids have a lot of money, we might not have that kind of abuse anyway. Shira, how about you?
So I want to just begin by recognizing I have the opportunity now to see the gallery view, how many partners of ours are on this call who are doing this work with us every day. And I can't begin to name all of you because there are so many, but so many of you here, you know who I'm talking to. Every single day you're in the trenches, and our work forward ahead of us is with you. So specifically, I want to share the following 3 things. One is that the World Health Organization reports that studies that ask staff at institutions that serve the elderly, have you ever abused any of the residents in your care? More than 60% say yes, I have committed elder abuse. That is an astonishing statistic, and yet it is the one area that as a Jewish community, including in our abuse prevention institutions, we are very minimally dealing with. And so to the extent that we are meant to deal with abuses of power occurring in Jewish institutions, we have to take on this issue. And so you will see in a week or 2 ahead, Sacred Spaces is about to release some significant resources after a year of research on this issue. 2, we have just launched, and I'm going to share my screen because it's kind of cool, and I hope you'll join us in being excited. I'll do this for a minute. This is our Aleinu campaign. Aleinu means it's on us, and this is about protecting children. It's on us to protect the children. And so Aleinu is based on 10 best practices in child protection. We break them down, and for each best practice, we have 3 goals. We embed it in Jewish values and Jewish texts. We give the 3 goals, and then we provide tools to institutions on how to implement. And what is so cutting edge about this is that the standards exist in this country, but the implementation tools don't. And these implementation tools are specific to the Jewish community. And thanks to a generous gift from the SRE, a grant we have gotten, we are going to be creating the adult version of this, which is to expand on the SRE self-assessment tool so that it is also a policy development tool and can really streamline what it is so that we can begin to scale this work to reach thousands of organizations. So that's what's ahead for us in terms of our work.
I know we need to close, but there's a question that I just want to address also about statistics and tracking what's happening during the pandemic. I'm not aware actually of sexual harassment statistics, either Jewish or non-Jewish, being tracked now. There might be, but I think it's very hard, again, with any of these things to know what's actually real right now, even with domestic violence, because so few people are able to reach out. And so I think we're going to have a long view and look 6 months from now to be able to look back, because I don't think a lot of the reporting is happening right now. So even if there is some real tracking, and we've seen, for example, a roughly 20% increase in domestic violence calls, but that may be underreporting. So I think we're going to have to really make sure that we look 6 or 8 months from now back to see what's been actually happening now, and also do the work now to make that reporting more possible, because it's very difficult for people to know how to reach out for help at this moment in time.